Can you hear it? Can you hear the echoes from the very beginning? There was a wind beginning to blow, a strong wind building, sweeping. Was a holy wind, because it was God's Spirit hovering over a watery chaos. And with that wind, God's voice, simply a voice, spoken into being our fragile, delicate, diverse, beautiful, very good world, began to turn. But listen, the first few drops, it was the rain beginning to splatter, drip, splash, spot. Listen carefully, because it'll become a storm soon. Rain, so much rain. It's God's tears over a torn people for 40 days and 40 nights until there were floodwaters. And then the floodwaters receded. And as water began to turn to land, God took an instrument of death and turned it around, upright. An instrument of death, the bow, was turned into a promise. Well, listen now. Can you hear the crackling flames, the bush burning in the desert, not consumed, but crackling and snapping? Moses turned aside to see the wonder, and listen, he heard. The voice of God calling, breaking in, breaking through, breaking the chains of enslavement. God calls, and a staff is turned into a serpent, a river is turned into a walkway, a people are turned into desert wanderers, and with blood, death turns aside, and freedom comes. The wind would blow again over the water, through the water, a wall of water. Can you hear it roaring? It makes a dry path for God's people, a safe passage, and there are enemies undone, and power is swept away. Well, sometimes that wind, it would blow, and it wasn't God. And the earthquake, that wasn't God either, but listen closely, because the whisper, the one that came right after, that was God. That was God calling out, but in a whisper. Because God would always call out to God's people. When they wandered, and when they knelt, and when they ran, and when they offered, and when they drifted, and when they dug in their heels, and as they were conquered and captured, as they capitulated, and as they called out too, God called to them. When their hearts turned, God called. And when the heat of the furnace was turned up on the faithful, God called out. Through Psalms and the prophet Jeremiah and in his Lamentations, God promises to turn their mourning into dancing, to bring life to God's people. And through prophets, through visions, through words, through whispers, God called to God's people, turn to me, return to the life that I made for you, for your community. And as they formed alliances and armies and communities and laws and regulations and hopes, God called, remember who formed you, who began the turning. Sometimes the prophets ran, but Jonah's boat was turned around. Sometimes it was the community that turned away, but that idol, it was melted. You will be my people, God promised, and I will be your God, God reminded him. Can you hear it? That promise? The people didn't always. They weren't listening, or at least they couldn't hear. And so God came to tell them in person, you are my people, and I am your God. You are my beloved, so love too. And this tiny baby God cried out in a cold, dark night, and then a young teenage God spoke up in a large, comfortable synagogue, and then Jesus, God, called some more. First, he called the fishermen, and then he called a tax collector, and he even called a zealot. And they turned to follow him. And so he renamed them disciples, and then friends. And then Jesus called out, my turned away in shame. And the demon voices plaguing, swirling in the head amongst the tombs, they turned off. And the children and the prostitutes, they turned up, and the authorities, they turned to one another in disbelief and in fear, because before he turned over tables, he turned over expectations. Love your neighbor, he said, certainly, but love your enemy too. Pray for God's kingdom to come, and for those who persecute you. Fulfill the law, the covenants, the commands, but above all, choose life first, for all, abundantly. To be great, you must serve. Sell all that you have. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. But then, the calling began again, differently. The authorities, they called for quiet. The crowds, they called out to Pilate, and so Jesus was taken and betrayed and beaten and nailed and pierced. Except that the God who had begun the turning in the beginning, God's voice calling everything into being, that God had begun what was to come and what will be. God had turned over an instrument of death before. Because when Jesus was taken, betrayed, and pierced, Jesus called out loud and clear. He turned to those in power, those agents of division and brokenness, those responding in fear, those authorities of all sorts, and he asked, "What do you call me?" When his friends had turned away, he turned to those who were hanging next to him, who had turned to him. He turned to God, and he cried out, but with his actions. And with his words and with his very nature, he called out loud and clear, and he said, enough. Enough division, enough marginalization, enough wielding of power over people who are different, enough brokenness, enough rupturing, enough of these small deaths, because death has had enough. God's power, God's voice, it had burned before, not consuming or destroying, but bringing life and breaking chains. God had made a way when there was no way. God's people had written before. God had promised to turn mourning into dancing. And so the granddaughters of Miriam, they took up their spices of mourning, but the stone was turned away, and they could go home for her tamarines. So listen again now. Can you hear what's calling now? Is it the empty echoes of an idle tale? Is it the vacant void of Holy Saturday's silence? Is it the hollow resonances of hope? Because the tomb was empty, and the Creator had not been captured by the cold, hard hands of death. No, instead, he had risen. And so that wind, it was blowing again. God was calling out, calling forth life instead, eternally. So listen then now. Because it's your turn to hear the song, the whisper, the call, the cry through the prophets, and their words of challenge through the saints, reminding us of God's extraordinariness in the midst of our seemingly ordinary lives, through the whispers, through the wind, through the stories that are told and yet unfolding. God calls out, so turn. Turn to that neighborhood that you always avoid. A place of division becoming a place of community. Return to that relationship, that vocation, that thing. A place of stagnation, of finding the new heart and the new spirit that God has put within it. Turn. Begin to turn that heavy wheel until it begins to turn more freely. Turn the tides of justice. Agents and weapons of marginalization and borders and pain should hear the cry too, enough and no more, because it is finished. Call out instead this idle tale. Call out instead that this place, it is very good. That the days are surely gentleness and self-control. Tell the good news over all the earth that he is risen